I'm Claire Morgan, an officer in the United States Navy, and this is the tale of how my father nearly married on the most significant day of my life. The huge wood chapel doors were illuminated by the red and gold streaks of stained glass windows that fell across the aisle. Sitting in the first pew was my father, Richard Morgan, who had that same arrogant expression I had seen since my youth. He didn't join me in celebrating. He was there to make fun of the decision in silence and to compare me to the ideal of a daughter he had always envisioned. I had forced myself to stand before him, not in a gown but in a uniform. As I walked in, I could feel his jaw tensing up, and his gaze was focused on the 4 stars shining on my shoulders. They were neither a sign of sacrifice nor respect to him. They were a clear rejection of his insistence that I, for once, be normal, and an affront to tradition. I could tell by the slight twist of a smirk on his lips that he believed he had already won and that my wedding would go down in history as the day his daughter embarrassed herself in front of her family and the public. All of them, the weight of years of being rejected, was on my every move down that aisle. My immaculately ironed clothing stood in stark contrast to the condemnation in his eyes. I sensed his disdain as I had all my life, a silent poison that was intended to diminish me. But a constant firmness lay beneath the surface. He'd neglected me at family gatherings, but I wasn't that girl. As an officer, I had taken decisions without speaking and held lives in my hands, the one where the chapel's atmosphere got quiet as the organ music grew louder. Uncertain of what to think of the scene, the visitors moved around in their chairs. My dad's smile got bigger, as though this was his last affirmation that I would never fit in with his world. He had no idea how the environment he was sitting in would change and what respect meant was going to undergo a revision. Awaiting just beyond the admiral's stillness on deck were the words that would shatter his confidence. The white outfit was spread out in front of me as I sat by myself in the bridal room a few hours prior to the ceremony. After years of sacrifice and dedication, I had earned the uniform. It seemed heavier than any war gear I had ever worn, though, at that very time. My phone buzzed on the table, and as I took it up, my father's message appeared on the screen. He spoke in a frigid, acerbic tone. Don't wear that dumb costume and make us seem foolish. He showed his contempt without trying. He believed that my profession was only a phase and that my outfit threatened the polished image he wished to project to the world. I wasn't prepared for the impact of the words. I'd been bearing the burden of his criticism for 20 years, each comment weighing heavily on my shoulders. He had referred to my deployments, diversions, and decorations as charms, and my leadership is nothing more than obstinacy. It felt like a purposeful blow to see that same disdain printed in black and white on the day of my wedding, as though he intended to remind me that, despite my greatest happiness, I was still insufficient for him. I clenched my teeth and fought the urge to breathe. However, within, I sensed the same pain of never being seen by the man who ought to have been proud. Without knocking, my brother Daniel entered through the open door. His demeanor was with all the effortless assurance of someone who has never been asked a question in his life. My father had always viewed Daniel as the perfect child, the one who could do no wrong. His laugh pierced me like a razor as he looked at the uniform hanging over the chair. He was serious when he said, "Dad is going to have a stroke, Claire. Can't you just be normal for one day?" He thought my outfit was a joke, a costume I had chosen to wear for Halloween. He took action. Lacked awareness of the load it carried or the people it represented. His main thought was to remind me of my position. He grinned at me, as though he had just given a witty joke, and I experienced the same old anguish and rage rising inside of me. Daniel had never waited in a desert for orders that may alter a mission's trajectory. Never in his life had he stayed up worrying about whether the men he commanded would return home. However, his tone was that of a haughty person who thought his corner workplace, and he was more valuable than I because of his financial achievement. I was playing military in his eyes, and he was creating a real life. Along with my parents, they had let that myth define our family for years, blinded by their pride in him. I thought of all the holiday dinners when his stories overshadowed mine as he leaned against the doorway. I recalled the gifts he received, the investments my parents made for him, and the times I was instructed to be thankful for the meager attention I received. My clothing wasn't the only thing that made him laugh at that moment. That meant a lifetime of rejection, a lifetime of hearing that my decisions were flawed, that my sacrifices were insignificant, and that my successes were in fact failures. I felt like yelling at him to show him that the outfit wasn't a costume. It summed up the conflicts, sleepless nights, and times when choices meant the difference between life and death. Death. Shouting, however, would not alter anything, I realized. In the world I lived in, I had to gain approval bit by bit, whereas Daniel's came naturally. He was no stranger to ridicule. It was merely the most recent reminder that I would never be able to surpass second position in the hierarchy my family had established. Still laughing at his own brutality, he walked out of the room. I turned my gaze back to the outfit. I was still haunted by my father's text, and I could still hear what Daniel had said. But there was more to it than the rage. I had learned to Be steady in the field. They could chuckle and ignore me, but this outfit did, in fact, have power. They couldn't even begin to comprehend. Eventually, on that day in that chapel, they would observe my transformation, whether they wished to or not. I still feel a great burden from that Christmas dinner. Richard, my dad, asserted his speaking as though the entire evening revolved around him in his customary position at the head of the table. Floating in and out of the conversation, my mother, Margaret, eased the tension before pretending to be unaware that the room's constant sense of imbalance could lead to sparks. Daniel was the focus of their attention, gleaming from the weight of their endorsement. Daniel sat back in his chair and related how he was recently promoted. His self-important tone came through in his voice with ease, and each pause was greeted with nods and grins. My parents listened intently to everything he said about his future in corner office, as though the corporate world was the only one worth living in. They listened quietly while realizing how recognizable this pattern was. I faded into the background while he spoke, and they applauded. At last, there was Ale attempted to join the conversation. Lol. Just a few weeks ago, I received a noteworthy medal, I said, not because I was ashamed, but because I already understood how it would set down. My father gave me another small pin after a half-second look and a pat on the arm. Then, turning back to Daniel, he spoke loudly once again with honor. My achievement vanished in that instant as if it had never been, engulfed by the light they kept for my brother and my brother. I used to be invisible, a shadow at the table of my own family, and more. The cold was leaking in through the windows as I waited in my car outside their house that evening after supper. My gaze was fixed on the steering wheel, and I repeated. When my father spoke that dismissive thing, he swept away my medal. I hoped it had just been an inconsiderate remark. I so-called my mom in the hopes she would mitigate the impact. She spoke softly, in the same tone she often used to soften the jagged edges of my father's remarks. He was, she informed me, from a different era, that he understood nothing about the world I lived in, and that his only goal was to see me established. Located. The words, diminished years of command, sank like a stone in my chest. Responsibility, and sacrifice into a phase that needed to be subdued. I sat silently as the reality pierced my being. My relatives would never recognize me for who I truly am. I would forever be the daughter pursuing something too weird, too odd, and too unsettling for their world. The door would never open, no matter how far I climbed to get their recognition. It was then that I understood I would have to live without it, and the agony of that reality would accompany me till I created something more robust for myself. Every man in the room was waiting for my word while the encrypted radios hummed softly. Shaky footage displayed the building where the hostages were held on the screen. The SEAL unit was trapped outside, huddled in the shadows. Time was passing too quickly. The voice of the squad commander came through, composed but tense, asking authorization to employ a last-ditch strategy that might spare their lives or end up costing everyone. All eyes went to me in that operating room. Captains, men who have been in combat for decades, are hardened. Waiting, they held their breath. Every rank and every choice that had led me to this point weighed heavily on me in that silence. My heart raced, yet I spoke. Remained constant. Put Alpha into action. Send the sitrep as soon as you're free. Only a sharp acknowledgement was given in response, and that's Valkyrie, Roger, my call sign. The phrase spread like a mark of authority throughout the room. This was neither a joke nor a moniker. That moniker implied that people trusted my judgment with their lives. Family ties or meaningless compliments did not create the respect in that room. That was won behind closed doors by decisions that were never discussed over a dinner table. I wasn't invisible in that world, either. I was spotted, and I was followed. My head was still blazing with my father's message as I sat there. I had heard the taunt, silly costume, all my life, and it was repeating. I had spent years trying to argue with him on his terms, seeking his acceptance through accomplishments and justifications in the hopes that one day he would see me. That optimism had vanished, replaced with through more acute clarity. He wouldn't have a stage or an opportunity to make fun of me during my wedding. I'd have it. I was lying. When I put on my uniform once more, I felt at ease. In order to please others, I would never wear silk or lace. Wearing the 4 stars I had won, I would allow them to communicate more effectively than I could ever hope to. I would put on a show for my family that they would never forget. If they only respected power they couldn't dispute. I set about planning with painstaking accuracy. According to procedure, the ushers would place my officers and SEALs in the front rows. It is my honor. The guard would strictly adhere to all rules. In full dress, the Fleet Admiral himself would officiate, giving legitimacy to all of my decisions. A fragment. I transformed the ceremony into a teaching moment, moment by moment. They believed they were at a wedding, but they were going to see a protest. It would be when my two worlds eventually came together, it would happen the way I wanted it to. Each note of the organ stretched the air thin with expectancy as it filled the chapel with its gentle reverberation. Then came the harsh, purposeful sound of boots hitting stone. 2 seals came in from the side doors, their outfits spotless, their steps precisely timed. They moved to the front in a precise march and positioned themselves like statues, watching over the area that would soon be mine. The visitors moved uneasily within their chairs. The sea of white and gold that filled the pews contrasted with their sharp suits and glittering jewelry. Military rose in uniforms, eyes forward, shoulders squared, sitting in silent discipline. The civilians let out low, unsure whispers, as though they had wandered into a ritual they did not entirely comprehend. The huge organ door swung wide as it swelled once again. In the United States Service uniform whites, I stepped into the aisle as sunlight flooded across it. Respected. The 4 stars on my shoulders, gleaming like keen points of truth, were reflected off the fabric. A brief period of quiet pierced the chapel as all eyes were on me. I noticed my father smirk cruelly as he leaned in Daniel's direction. He uttered a loud whisper and shook his head slightly. Sufficient for the people nearest to hear. Her appearance is absurd. Little and piercing, the words hung in the air, reducing me to nothing. However, I continued to walk steadily and unflinchingly, knowing that the moment he believed was his was going to pass him by forever. A single command disturbed the stillness in the chapel, a piercing voice that shattered the stone walls. The Admiral is on deck. The words reverberated authoritatively. In the same sentence, 150 officers and SEALs stood up. It was a thunderous movement. A single, respectful, and disciplined wave swept through the pews like a tempest. There was a clear and unmistakable recognition of my identity in the air as hundreds of palms snapped into salute. People in the street gasped. A moment later, the whispers were silent. I was surrounded by senators, captains, and commanders who looked at me with a respect that my own family had never shown. It wasn't cheers. The recognition was unassailable and earned. I turned to see my family sitting motionless in the front row, beyond the sea of salutes. My own face was white with horror as her mother's palm closed over her mouth. Daniel's mouth fell open, his haughtiness engulfed by bewilderment. But it belonged to my dad. A look that made me freeze. The smugness vanished as the truth sank in, to be followed by incredulity, rage, and then a naive terror. The costume wasn't this. There was no face to this. The weight of the 4 stars on my shoulders was greater than all of his money and cockiness. Regarding the initial, when my father finally saw me for who I really was, it left him exposed. Because his daughter was respected by warriors he could never have, he sat shaking and pallid, a man undone. Intend to comprehend. The warm light in the reception area bounced off glass cases containing historical artifacts and naval pictures. A chuckle and senators, officers, and SEALs surrounded me, and talk flowed naturally. They talked of missions accomplished in silence, leadership, and sacrifice, as well as for it was the first time in years that I felt really noticed. Every greeting and expression of respect served as a reminder that this was my world, which I had created via accountability and service. In a corner across the room, my family was crowded together. Their sophisticated grins and pricey outfits were somehow hollow under the weight of the medals and uniforms that held actual meaning. They were not contacted because they did not belong. Not because they were unkind. They were phantoms in a place full of dignity and friendship. The customary gleam of superiority was gone from Daniel's eyes when I saw him looking down at the ground. My mom stood rigidly, gripping her glass, trying to find words that would not come. And my father, who used to be so confident and loud, now appeared small, weakened by a reality that he was powerless to change. They had no authority, no control, and no audience here. As the night wore on, they crept out a side door without a word. There were no farewells or congrats, only quiet as they vanished into the distance. Despite not following, I did not long to have them stay. There was no gap in their absence. The silent affirmation was that although blood ties people together, respect is what survives. I stood in my office with a view of Washington years later. As a reminder of my journey, the metropolis stretches out below me. With each step, I gained not just responsibility but also the silent respect of people who recognized the weight of authority, and my career had taken me farther than I had previously thought imaginable. With Ryan, my spouse and fellow cop, who bore his own problems and never required my explanation, life at home was more stable. We didn't use meaningless compliments to gauge affection or conditional permission. We were founded on a shared understanding that was forged in the same furnace of sacrifice and dedication. These days, when I consider family, I don't think about biological ties or the false expectations that formerly characterized me. My real family was the group of people who supported me voluntarily rather than out of obligation. It was a family founded on trust, respect, and the kind of love that can withstand the loss of all else. What someone passes down to you is not a legacy. It's what you strive to achieve, what you make a sacrifice for, and what you receive payment for. People stand up for you and see your value. I discovered that the definition of a family is not blood, but the individuals who decide to respect and walk with you. If you ever created a family of your own using trust, loyalty, and respect, I'd love to hear your story. Please share it below, so that others can know they're not by themselves. In this area, your voice counts, and your tale may motivate someone who must listen to it.